The clock on the emergency room wall read a little past 3 in the morning, its blue numbers cutting through the half-sleep fog that hangs over New York at that hour. Outside, the Upper East Side had the look of a city taking a breath, rain slicking the streets, a taxi sliding past, an occasional siren like a memory in the distance. Inside New York Presbyterian, the night crew kept moving. We all have a way of pretending we are simply doing our jobs, even when everything else in us is fraying. I am Dr. Michael Carter, and I will tell this like a man who has learned to say things plainly. I wear my white coat the way some men wear armor. It keeps my hand steady when a scanner shows a hidden bleed, when an arrhythmia throws itself across the monitor like a warning. People call me composed. They do not see the places I have tried to seal with work. I do not parade my failures. I bury them between charts and overnight calls. That night the ER felt both too quiet and too loud. Quiet because the normal chaos had thinned to a few determined sounds, nurses speaking low, an orderly's mop squeaking on tile, the constant soft click of monitors that never sleep. Loud because my head would not stop replaying the old noise until it became louder than anything on the floor, the sound of a car brake shrieking, a chest compressions team shouting, a child who does not wake up. That silence lived inside me like a second rhythm I had learned to ignore. The man arrived with the kind of commotion that makes a whole bay pivot. 2 EMTs slid him through the double doors on a rolling gurney, rain dripping from their jackets. He was in his 30s, clothes torn, feet bare, face streaked with grime and dried blood. No identification. No wallet. One paramedic barked the usual, voice clipped by the adrenaline of a transfer, found him near 10th Avenue. Name was said, but then he lost consciousness. I do not remember a lot of the motions after that. It is funny how automatic the body becomes. I slipped on gloves without thinking about it. I looked at his side, at the shallow tearing of skin there. It was not the kind of wound that should have stopped a man cold. I was about to call for a scan when his eyes opened. I will not pretend I was not surprised. I have treated delirious patients, people who spoke strange things under the sway of fever. This was not delirium. His gaze fixed on me and held, steady and deep like a well whose bottom I could not see. It was a look I had seen on fathers in panic, on people who had accepted a hard truth. When he spoke, his voice was thin and rough, but the words landed like stones. I came for you, Michael. My badge was hidden in my pocket. Somebody had to have said my name. I was not off duty. I do not have the luxury of being anonymous on my own floor. Do we know him? I asked, because that is what doctors ask when we need a ledger of facts. The nurse heard the name too and her brow lifted. The man offered no identification. He only smiled faintly, like the smile of a person who already knew whatever question I would think next. He closed his eyes and sank back. Someone at the bedside muttered, delirious. In every other case that might have been the end of it. Not that night. Those words stayed with me in a way I could not name. I came for you. They felt personal, not the ramble of a patient lost to shock. They cut through the sterile hum of lights and monitors. They dug under the measured steadiness of my day-to-day and found what I had buried, the part of me that kept spinning a film of that summer night 3 years earlier when my son, Ethan, died. Ethan was 9 then. He had a laugh that ricocheted around our small apartment like a toy drum. He loved a red soccer ball the way other boys loved superheroes. One terrible instant changed everything. A driver, an error, a life gone. I rushed into the hospital not as a doctor, but as a father on his knees. There is no training guide for that kind of desperation. There is no textbook for the sound a father makes when the machine stops and a small chest does not rise again. In the hours that followed, I learned that some things will not be fixed by sutures or antibiotics. After the funeral, we tried to be a family. My wife Anna and I tried to be people who could stitch ourselves back together. It did not stick. She left, one morning, a note that said she could no longer live with a ghost of who I had become. The second loss was quieter but no less complete. I dug into medicine because there you can measure the problem and, if you are very good, fix it. Faith felt like an empty room. I drove past churches without looking. The name Jesus Christ became for me a phrase people used when they had run out of medicine to try. And yet, in the bright chaos of the ER, a man who gave me no records, a man who could have been anyone, said something that unsettled me deeper than any tumor ever had. I came for you. It was not the kind of pronouncement you dismiss with a shrug. We ran him through the usual checks and the usual talk. He said his name was Jesus Christ. The nurses raised their eyebrows. The resident laughed nervously and wrote John Doe on the whiteboard. It is safer to laugh than to think about the impossible. But laughing did not help. His presence unsettled more than the staff's routine. People began to tell stories. Small things at first. The cleaning woman who said he had told her she was not invisible. The night transporter who swore he had told her where her missing daughter was. I heard it and I pulled back. It made me nervous to hear about miracles in a place that runs on evidence. I watched him in the observation bay. He lay pale, breathing shallowly, the shallow wound at his side still weeping a little blood. Nurses came and went. He did not ask for much. He did not flinch at the lab draws. When he opened his mouth, he said the same thing, "You have been carrying it too long." That was the phrase that did the work. I tried to shove it away. I am a doctor of bodies. Emotion is messy and hard to measure. Yet it hit me like a blunted instrument. You have been carrying it too long. I could not tell whether it was accusation or compassion. I could not tell if the man was a clever manipulator or under the influence of a mind I could not diagnose. I only knew the effect. My chest tightened like it does before I run a code. I told the paramedics who brought him that we would keep him in observation and that I would do the formal evaluation. They left, doors closing, rain tapping on their hoods. I did not follow them. I followed the weight of what he said. For the first time in a long time I went to a place I had not dared, the hospital chapel. If you work here for years, you learn exactly where the quiet rooms hide. The chapel is an unassuming corner on the old wing, pews well worn by hands that wanted to hold on to something, stained glass that throws the morning into color. I had not been there since the night Ethan was taken. I had avoided it the way some men avoid mirrors. I found him there. No monitors, no 4 poles. Just the man sitting quietly on a pew, hands folded. He looked how people look when they are not trying to be something they are not. Human. Tired. I had the strange, irrational urge to ask 1,000 things that would make a physician seem small and childish. How did you get here? Why my name? What did you mean by that? He did not answer like a detective. He spoke like a neighbor who had walked over because the lawn looked neglected. You came because your heart was louder than your doubt, he said simply. There is no clinical term for how dismissive that is of my training. It is unsettling. I am not a man who weeps easily. But in that dim room, with light bleeding through colored glass, I felt the edges of my control fray. He talked about forgiveness without making it sound like a sermon. He said forgiveness was not pretending that anything was all right, but putting down the heavy stone I had carried like a monument to my failure. He said that love does not vanish because we are angry. He did not fix my son. He did not reach into the past and undo what was done. He did not say that everything would be perfect. He said this, every day you choose, you can choose differently. The sentence arrived like a small key finding an old lock. When I walked back into the bay a few hours later, the ward felt altered. People moved with a gentleness that was new. Nurses stayed a few minutes longer with families. An intern leaned down to hold a hand. It was subtle, but it was real. The man in Bay 3, the one who called himself Jesus Christ, had that effect on people like a pebble dropped in a still pond. And then the night shifted again. He grew feverish. Monitors coughed up numbers that did not fit explanations. We ran panels. We ordered imaging. Tests came back clear. I felt my hands close around charts the way a drowning man grips driftwood. Nothing said he should fail. Yet he did not improve quickly. He lay with the slow, deliberate peace of people who live on another timetable. Do not fear what ends, he told me when my voice had the brittle edge of a man afraid he could not hold on. Fear what never begins. He squeezed my hand with the last of his strength and for a moment, a ridiculous, human moment, all I wanted was for him to stay. But one morning I woke to silence. The bed was empty. The sheets were tucked as if no one had ever slept there. I ran down halls like a man losing his mind. Cameras showed nurses moving, beds empty. Files that I had written and believed I had signed were blank in the system. The patient, the man who had said my name, had left no trace. People argued whether he had been a con man, a mental patient who wandered out, a trick of sleep deprivation. I knew what I had seen. I knew the change that had been set loose. The note I found in the chapel that morning was written in a script I did not know and read, "The greatest miracles are not in healing the body, but in remembering how to love." I believe in medicine. I also learned, slowly and painfully, that medicine sometimes forgets the heart in favor of the body. Maybe that is why the man had to leave no records. Maybe some things cannot be catalogued. I carried the memory of the empty bed with me like a small flame. This is where the nights in Bay 3 begin for me. It is where the work of story starts, not with a diagnosis, but with a question that is harder than any one I learned in training. Who tends the soul when the body is stable? Who speaks to the places our instruments cannot read? If you are still with me, keep listening. I will tell you more. But this is the first part, and these are the pieces I had to lay down before anything else could make sense. My head felt like a blender that would not stop. All the years of school, the endless nights on call, the cases that sharpened me into someone who trusted only what I could see and measure, they all slammed together with those two simple lines from a stranger. I went from thinking in neat medical categories to feeling as if someone had appended my filing cabinet and scattered everything across the floor. I suppose that is what happens when your most reliable tools cannot touch the thing that hurts the most. I had spent a life learning the language of anatomy and physiology. I knew how to read a rhythm strip, how to name a fracture, how to pronounce a prognosis. I did not have words for the kind of grief that sits like a stone in your chest, a weight that does not change with treatment plans or improved vitals. Diego, our young intern, watched me. He must have seen the way I folded my shoulders, the way I rubbed my face like a man trying to loosen shackles. He had his own private burdens. He had been praying for his mother through a hard fight with cancer, and he took comfort in the idea that someone or something might be more than random. When he saw me that night, he did not need to ask many questions. He already felt the shift. To him, the patient was not random. To me, that thought felt dangerous. I planted myself in a chair in the staff lounge because being in one place felt safer than spinning through the ward. Anger rose first, an old defense. You learn to box up the things that make you fragile and present a hardened exterior. Anger is useful, it keeps other people from seeing the cracks. I tried to armor myself with it. What does medicine do? I told the empty room, the words more to steady myself than to reason anything out. Medicine saves lives. It is blood products. Antibiotics, precise incisions. It is measurable interventions. It is not faith. It is not prayer. He did not reply in anger. He spoke like someone pointing out an obvious truth you had been refusing to accept. Science is a language that describes the body, he said. Faith is a language that speaks to the spirit. Both are true, but you have been speaking only one of them. I remember clenching my fists. It felt like being accused of a sin I had not committed on purpose. What did faith give me? I asked into the steam of my coffee, which had long gone cold. My son did not survive. My wife left. If God exists, he was silent when I needed him most. He was quiet when he answered, but quiet does not mean gentle. His voice carried an unrelenting clarity. Your son is not gone from love. Neither are you. You have not been abandoned in the way you fear. That line hit somewhere behind the place where a man stores his disbelief. I stood up too fast, knocked the chair back, felt the small, childish flare of wanting to deny every soft thing that unsettled me. I stormed out of the break room and into the corridor. Sonia, our veteran nurse, reached like she might stop me, but I brushed by. I did not want to be seen unraveling. At the sink in the staff bathroom I threw water on my face until I tasted hospital metal. It did not wash anything away. It only made me colder and more exposed. For 3 years I had been an expert at hiding what could not be fixed with a chart. I had learned the rituals of work to avoid the rituals of mourning. Then a man with no file and a name that made some people smile and some people frown had said something I could not shake. He had spoken as if he had read the margins of my life. I will admit this now because I am telling you the truth, curiosity brought me somewhere I had not planned to go. I avoid the chapel the way some men avoid the dentist. But that night my footsteps found the old wooden door on their own. The chapel lives in a quiet corner of the hospital, behind doors you only notice if you are looking for silence. The pews have been smoothed by decades of hands. The windows spill color when the day is right, and the place smells faintly of wax and the kind of incense that does not linger long. It is a small shelter from the fluorescent clang of the rest of the building. I almost walked away. My hand stalled on the handle. It was cowardice, or perhaps it was respect. In the end, some part of me that did not belong to logic opened the door. He was there. No monitors. No tubing. Just a simple man perched 2 pews ahead of me, hands folded, looking like someone waiting for a train that had already been announced. I will not pretend that the sight made everything make sense. It did not. It did, however, make my throat close. I could have been watching a memory made flesh. I could have been watching a con man. I could have been imagining things. 1,000 rational explanations bubbled up. He settled them the way you settle a cup on a saucer. You came because your heart was louder than your doubt, he said. Not a trick, not a riddle. A sentence you might hear from a friend who has seen you at your worst and has not walked away. Why here? I asked him. Why follow me? He looked at me like he had been waiting a long time. I did not follow you, Michael, he said. You came because something finally shouted louder than your reason. I remember the way my voice broke when I answered, the way my hands found my knees because I needed to hold on to anything. I did not come, I said. Not then, not when Ethan died, not when Anna left. I was too ashamed. I was too angry. He did not judge. He offered the kind of compassion that is at once infuriating and stabilizing. Forgiveness is not pretending that it was okay, he said. It is laying down the rock you have carried, even when there is no one to return it to you. That image went inside me like a dull instrument. There is doing and there is being. I had done enough, and in doing I had not learned to be. When he left the chapel that morning he walked like a man who did not need approval. He paused at the door and said, "Every day is a chance to choose again. You do not need to be perfect to be loved. You just need to stop hiding." Simple words. Insensitive to my training. They burned like a coal that warmed and also threatened to burn a hand. What happened next stayed with the hospital the way light lingers on glass. The man in Bay 3, the one who told me I had been carrying too long, had a way of touching the places people kept locked. He did not give everyone a miracle in the flashy sense. He gave people permission. To cry. To call. To forgive. To hope. It started small. A cleaner who sweeps the night told anyone who would listen that the man had looked at her and said she mattered. She had been invisible for decades of work. A transporter named Teresa, quiet, efficient, the sort of person people do not notice until something goes wrong, said he looked at her and named her deepest fear, that her daughter had run away and would not come back. He told her the name of a city and an occupation and something so specific she fell to her knees in the break room and could not speak for a long time. Mrs. Dalton, a woman on palliative care who would have otherwise drifted through her last hours sedated and confused, smiled when he sat near her bed and said, "You will see him soon. Do not be afraid." She passed with a smile on her face and a hand that had been held. These are not things you tuck into a chart. You cannot write them on a discharge summary. Yet people who had been touched by him walked a little straighter, spoke a little softer, carried candles to the chapel between shifts. Something unquantifiable moved through the building. It was not measurable by labs or imaging. It was measurable by the change in how a nurse leaned in to listen. A man at the bedside is no longer simply a subject of care when you remember he is also someone's story. Not everyone believed. There were always the skeptics who muttered psychosis or clever manipulation. An orderly shrugged, saying people see what they want to see. Even the attending physician, Dr. Rosales, kept one eyebrow high and his clinical skepticism ready. This was hospital life. People cling to stories. We do not always have the time to untangle everything. But the man continued to speak in direct, unsettling ways. He cornered Sonia, our older nurse who always presented a face like weathered stone, and said, "Your father forgave you long before you forgave yourself." Sonia sat down hard and began to cry in the supply room. She had never told anyone about leaving her aging father because she could not watch him go. The sentence released something in her that no antibiotic could have. She told us later that it felt like a confession and a release all at once. Diego, the intern, was a different story. He had clung to surgical dreams, to the hands-on certainty of fixing a problem and closing the wound. The patient gave him a line he could not shake: "Forgiveness is not for them. It is the gift you give yourself." Over nights of thinking, of watching me handle the things that break people on the outside, Diego began to talk about changing his path. He started to look at psychiatry the way he had once looked at sutures. "Sometimes the wounds inside decide whether a person lives," he told a supervisor. I was not keen at first, but he had that quiet steel about him. There came a night when the ward held its breath. The man began to fail in ways that did not fit medical logic. He developed a fever and then his blood pressure slipped and he became pale like someone who was fainting to a sky of a different sort. We did everything the book said. Cultures came back clean, imaging showed nothing to explain the turn, the wound at his side was superficial. Every parameter told me he should be fine. And yet his body talked a language we could not translate. The monitors screamed a story that made us move like a team that had prepared for a scenario and yet was surprised by the invitation. I barked orders like a man clinging to the last rope. Antibiotics, fluids, oxygen, repeat cultures. Stat labs. Get a chest x-ray. Everyone moved. Diego ran like a man who had learned to love medicine and was now learning how to love mercy. Sonia and Sonia moved with the practiced choreography of people who do not panic. They did not know why his body rejected our care. He looked at me with a softness I had not seen before and whispered something that felt like a benediction: "Do not fear what ends. Fear what never begins." I wanted to snarl, to assert the holy ground of reason, but my voice was small. I gripped the bed rail like a man afraid to let go of the last anchor. Hours and long minutes later, he stabilized. No one could explain why he trembled back from the edge when the chart suggested he should not. We all exchanged looks that carried the weight of a new, unspoken possibility. Maybe the night had rounded a corner and left us with questions. Maybe it had given us a doorway we were not ready to walk through. I slept the way you sleep when you have not given up something but are not sure you can carry it anymore, uneasy, with sudden flares of adrenaline the way small fires flare when someone tries to smother them. Then he disappeared. I came into the bay and the bed had been remade as if no one had ever slept there, the sheets tucked tight, for lines coiled where they belonged, monitors unwired like someone had planned everything carefully. The sterile scene made no sense. The nursing chart lay blank where I had been sure I had written 100 little notes. I called to Sonia and she blinked at me like she had not been in that room. "Who are you talking about?" she asked. I ran the building for records. The name that had been on nobody's chart, Jesus Christ, had evaporated. Where I had swiped through notes there was nothing. The computer showed no admission under his name, no orders pending. The notes that I had been certain I had written in my own hand, vitals, labs, the little margin scribbles doctors make at 2 a.m, were blank. Security pulled the footage. In the grainy gray of the camera you could see the bed, the chair, the slow passage of people. At one point the camera showed me sitting in the chair, my head falling forward. At another it showed nothing but the room, empty and quiet. The bed was always empty. The analyst muttered about software glitches, lost frames, corrupted files. That is plausible until your hands shake and you remember the weight of a pulse beneath your fingertips. I do not like admitting how shaky I felt. There are parts of a man's life where we try to keep our footing, the kinds of things you do not tell people because you are afraid they will take them away. I told Diego what I had seen. He nodded like someone trying on reality and holding it to the light. "I saw him," he said simply. He had the look of a man who had been touched and would not pretend otherwise. Other people were not so sure. Dr. Rosales suggested I might be tired, that grief plays tricks on excellent clinicians, that perhaps we should sleep before we rewrite memory. I was angry enough to argue but exhausted enough to listen. The ward continued. People discussed the possibilities. Rumors that he had been a trickster spread alongside testimonies that he had told a dying woman she would meet her husband on the other side and she went with a smile. I found a scrap of paper in the chapel one morning. It was folded, as if someone had left it for whoever needed it. The handwriting was not mine, not Diego's, not Sonia's. The phrase on it read like a small sermon: "The greatest miracles are not in healing the body but in remembering how to love." 3 weeks passed. The night shifts returned to a rhythm that looks like normal to the outsider, stretchers rolling, orders called, pages buzzing at all hours. Yet nothing was the same where we marched with new tenderness. I found myself asking families questions that were not on any exam checklist. Who is waiting for you outside this room? I began to hold hands at the end of rounds. Patients noticed. Families noticed. Some of my colleagues noticed and joined in. Diego changed his plan. He walked into my office one afternoon with a form in his hand and eyes that were not the same as when he had arrived. I am applying to psychiatry, he said. Surgery is good, but I do not want to only mend what is visible. It was the change of someone who had learned that the invisible sometimes decides the fate of a body. Teresa got a phone call from a number she had not expected. Her daughter, years gone, was alive and working in a small city in Texas. The reunion was messy and beautiful and changed Teresa into someone lighter. Sonia allowed herself to tell a story about her father and wept while she did it, and when she stopped the telling she nodded like a woman who had let something heavy fall from her shoulders. The chapel that had been so often empty began to fill. Interns flicked on lights to read, nurses left shifts early to sit in silence, surgeons paused like men who had been running on autopilot and needed to feel their feet on the ground. I did not pray in a rote way. I did not suddenly understand everything. But I sat in the quiet and read the small note in my pocket over and over. It became a talisman of sorts. One day I stood before a roomful of interns. This was not my usual lecture on cardiology or trauma protocols. I put the slides aside. I told them what I had seen and what it had done to me. I told them that there will be times when you will feel like you failed a patient no matter how hard you tried, and there will be times when you can be present in ways that do not appear in charts. Medicine is more than numbers, I said. Sometimes the greatest remedy you can offer is your steady presence. One of them raised his hand and asked bluntly, "Do you believe in miracles, Dr. Carter?" I did not want to be trite. I did not want to borrow faith I had not earned. I said this instead: when unconditional love shows up at a bedside, when it gives people the courage to pick up a phone, to call a father, to forgive, to sleep without terror, that is the greatest kind of miracle I have ever seen. That was the truth as I had gradually learned to know it. It was not a resignation of reason. It was an expansion of what reason could hold. I still ordered tests. I still insisted that a fever be investigated. I still demanded evidence where evidence mattered. But I also learned to ask, who will hold this person while the tests run? Who will speak to the part that does not show up on any form? There are things you cannot prove with blood work. There are things that leave no paper trail. There are men who wander through the night and change the way a hospital breathes and leave no print in the system. I have spent nights trying to sort what the world offers into neat boxes. This man did not fit into any. So I walked out of the hospital one evening, the river glittering across the road with city lights like coins, and I felt something shift under my feet. I did not clutch at proof anymore. I carried the ember of that encounter in my chest like a small, obedient piece of warmth. It was enough to keep me awake. It was enough to make me kinder. Part 2 ends here, and the thread is not tied off. There are more parts to tell: how the ripples spread beyond the staff rooms, how families mended in slow ways, how I kept returning to the question of what it means to heal a soul. If you want the next piece, I will keep going. The days after the empty bed felt like walking through a neighborhood after a storm. The streets look the same at first, but if you pay attention you will see the little things that have changed: a crooked mailbox fixed, a tree that leans a degree straighter, a neighbor who now actually says hello. That is how it was at New York Presbyterian Hospital. The fluorescent lights hung the same. The paging system still cut through the air. The stretchers still rattled down corridors. But underneath it all there was a softness that had not been there before. I noticed it first in the way people spoke to one another on the overnight shift. Nurses who had a habit of answering in clipped sentences started to linger. They pulled a chair closer and let the space between themselves and a grieving family be a little smaller. Orderlies who had always kept their heads down found themselves telling short stories about their kids. My own hands moved differently. When I checked a chart, I found myself asking questions I had not asked in years: who waits for you when you leave this floor? Who will be at your bedside if you cannot speak? They were small things. Small things pile up. They change the shape of a place. Word moved faster in that building than any pager could. People passed stories like contraband that warned them on cold nights. The cleaner who said she was not invisible got a shout-out on a staff forum and a small card from a family who had seen her kindness. Teresa, the transporter whose knees hit the floor when she heard the details about her daughter, took a leave to go find Camilla. The reunion in Houston was messy and real and exactly what it should have been: cries, a coffee shop with too strong coffee, a daughter who had been afraid to call and a mother who had been afraid to hope. I watched Teresa walk through the ward the week after she got back and I saw the way she moved like a person with extra light inside. Diego changed his path. He told me he had always liked the precision of surgery, the way a hand could make a wound obedient. But he had also seen how the smallest word, the single question spoken at the right time, could change a life. He applied for psychiatry and did not look back. He told me, "I want to learn the language of the part of people that the scanners cannot read." He has always had a way of listening that catches what people do not say. I think he will be good at it. Not everything was sweetness and second chances. Hospitals are complicated like cities are complicated. There were people who laughed at the stories, who said it was a con, that someone had come through telling people what they wanted to hear. There were skeptics who scrawled "psychosis" in the margin of conversation. The hospital board called men from risk management who asked the kind of practical questions administrators ask: where was he admitted? Who signed the consent forms? Are there security footage that show him leaving? They were not trying to be cruel. They had jobs that meant they had to ask those questions. It was the lack of answers that unnerved them. The medical records were empty in a way that looked like a mistake until you sat with it and felt it like a missing tooth. The security footage had frames that showed the room filled with people, then blank sheets where a body should have been. The technicians blamed software. The analysts suggested corrupted drives. The explanation sounded thin and cold in my mouth. I had touched him. I had held his wrist. I had listened to a voice that spoke my name with a certainty no one else had. There was a short period when the hospital became a magnet for speculation. A local reporter came, asking careful questions and scribbling faster than most residents on rounds. She was not unkind. She was careful in her words. "We want to tell the human story," she said. "I do not enjoy press. I dislike having private things turned into headlines. Yet I also know that hospitals are public places in ways homes are not. People have a right to know what moves them." I said only what I knew. I said enough to make the newsroom sit up and listen, and that made the rumor mill churn harder. But the attention did not destroy us. If anything, it made the small acts of kindness more visible. Families began to leave messages in the chapel. A grandmother left a knitting needle and a tiny scarf and a note that said, "For whoever needs warmth." Interns started bringing home-baked cookies to the night staff. The chapel started to fill at odd hours with people who wanted to sit in something other than fluorescent light. They wanted a place where the world could pause for a moment. I began to notice how this change reached into places I would not have expected. There was a man in medical records who had worked the night before the vanishing and who, after a brief conversation about nothing that mattered, went home and made a telephone call he had not made in 20 years. He told me later that he had been carrying a quiet thing for a long time, the failure to say goodbye to his brother. It was small, he told me, as if that would shrink it. But I needed someone to make me brave enough to do it. That is what I have seen this whole time, bravery growing like grass through cracks. At the same time, there was a tug in me that I could not ignore. I had always been a man who measured outcomes, survival rates, complication rates, the cold numbers that safe hospitals love. It is how we know whether a technique works. Plans require measures. But there are measures we forget to take: the number of families who are able to speak their grief out loud, the number of patients who can meet their visitors without collapsing. Those are not metrics captured in the usual dashboards. They are the quiet metrics that become the fabric of care. On the weeks that followed, I made a decision to open up the rounds. I asked interns to speak to the person in the bed, to ask them about a thing that was not on the chart. "Who do I call if I do not come back?" became one of the questions we used, and I watched people look at one another differently when that question was spoken. The answers were not always pretty. Sometimes there was silence and then a choked name. Sometimes there was laughter. Sometimes there were telephones that connected people to lives they had put on hold. Sonia, who had been a wall of calm for as long as I had worked with her, told me a story in the supply room one late night. She spoke slow, careful, as if every syllable was a step. I thought forgiving my father meant pretending I did not feel wronged, she said. I had assumed she had found some small peace. She said the man in Bay 3 had told her, "Your father forgave you before you ever forgave yourself." That line unhooked years of avoidance. She called her sister and they spoke like women who had found a secret door they had kept shut too long. I felt something else shift inside me. The chapel that I had avoided became familiar in the way a couch is familiar, not because I wanted to lounge, but because it was a place I could sit without explaining why I was there. I began to bring a notebook and write down short phrases I wanted to remember. I wrote things like, "Ask about the person, not just the illness," and "Presence can be a kind of medicine." I did not write any dogma in that notebook. I wrote practices that I could keep. Practices I could explain to my team. It is easy to forget that doctors are human. I had spent years constructing a self that would not crack in front of families. I thought the right path was to be unflappable. That approach saves lives when the stakes are strictly clinical. Yet I had not been tending the rest of myself. I had not been learning how to hold the fact that a father is small in the face of death. Then, 2 months after the vanishing, something happened that I had not predicted. A woman appeared at the emergency room entrance with a hand-lettered sign and a duffel bag. She had hair that did not pretend to be anything aside from the color it was, and eyes that had slept less than are healthy. She said she had come from Ohio because she had read a story about a patient who knew things. She said she had a son who had been missing for 9 years and that the man in Bay 3 had told her where to look. She had the look of someone who could not afford to be disappointed again. I do not know why stories like that matter to me. Maybe because I saw the same desperation in my own face when I ran into the emergency room that night with Ethan in my arms. Maybe because I wanted to believe that there was a thread connecting what I had seen to something bigger than my own grief. I did not know whether to hope with her. It would have been easy to give her the polite shrug that professionals use when faced with impossible pleas. Instead, I asked her to sit down and tell me everything. We made a plan to see what could be verified. Her voice was small at first, then stronger. The rest of the hospital watched as she walked away with a volunteer who promised to help. It was the kind of moment that does not appear in a report but changes the way you see the people around you. That was the pattern in those months, small acts that added up. People called fathers. People made appointments. People finally said the names of the ones they missed. They embraced imperfect forgiveness and discovered that it was not a betrayal of memory but a form of survival. Still, I needed a way to reconcile what I had been taught with what I had seen. I sought out a colleague who worked in pastoral care. He was a quiet man who had spent years listening to stories that lived on both sides of the technical and the ineffable. We spoke about boundaries and about the way clerks and systems sometimes fail to record things that matter. He suggested that the hospital could be a place where the threads of measurable medicine and human attention were woven together, like two separate looms creating a single cloth. We talked about how to create a safer way for people to share their stories without making the hospital a spectacle. I began to convene short meetings in the staff lounge. Not grand committees, but practical conversations. We talked about making space for chaplain visits that were responsive, not generic. We discussed whether it was possible to create a simple note in the chart that captured a non-clinical need, a person who wanted someone to call at night, the name of a neighbor who could make tea, a note that said, "Likes country music," for a patient who would feel more human when someone mentioned Hank Williams. It was odd how small the ideas were, and how big the effect felt. While I was busy trying to make systems that honored what had happened, life kept moving anyway. The city did what cities do. People were born. People died. The emergency room took in blunt trauma, overdoses, heart attacks. The pager still demanded my attention at 3 in the morning. The work I loved still lived where it always had, right at the edge of life and death. But now there was an added layer of tenderness. We were learning, slowly, to hold both the clinical and the human at once. I have not told my story because I wanted praise or because I wanted to make faith out of spectacle. I am telling it because the change was real and because it mattered. I think that is the reason more people started writing thank you notes in the chapel. They wanted to mark the place where something shifted and to leave a small witness that it had happened. Sometimes miracles are not fireworks. Sometimes they are a cleaned room, a phone call that reconnects people, a doctor who asks a question that opens a door. Maybe those things are small. Maybe they are the most important things. I still struggle in the dark moments. I am still a man who can be stubborn about what counts as evidence. I still carry images of a small boy and the sound of a stopped heartbeat. Those things do not go away. They become part of the mix. But now they share space with other things. People who had been too afraid to say, "I miss you," began to say it out loud. Families forgave in fits and starts. The hospital learned that making room for things that do not fit on a chart is not softness but strength. There is more to tell. There are still questions without paper trails. There are still nights when the ward hums in a way that makes me want to step into the chapel simply to remember the line written on that scrap of paper: the greatest miracles are not in healing the body, but in remembering how to love. I keep that sentence folded in my pocket like a small map. Part 3 ends here. If you want to keep going, I will tell you what happened when the ripples reached outside our building and what it meant for me when mercy began to look like ordinary work. After the days and weeks when the hospital felt different in small ways, the change began to reach past our doors like water finding the lowest places. The story of the nameless man who called himself Jesus Christ was already in the hospital's quiet corners, but then it leaked out. A family told a neighbor. A nurse posted a note in a group chat. Somebody put a photograph of the chapel candle on social media. Once the world smells a story, it does what it always does: it feeds on it and then it transforms it. I do not like headlines. I do not like having private things turned into public spectacles. But this thing had weight, it had touched people in ways that did not belong to any single person. So when reporters started calling, I answered enough to keep things honest without turning our chapel into a circus. The press wanted a mystery with a neat angle. I tried to give them truth. The hospital had received a man on a rainy night. He said a few strange things. A number of people left feeling lighter. That was the sum of what I knew and what I could say without floating away into speculation. Still, rumors gathered momentum. There were columns that flirted with the miraculous and op-eds that fretted over gullibility. Somebody suggested that the patient was a confidence man, a smooth operator who had wandered wards and told people what they wanted to hear. Another wrote about the need for clinical caution in the face of the inexplicable. I read a lot of both kinds of pieces and I felt both the sting of skepticism and the ache of people not seeing what I had seen, the way a single voice can unbar a door inside someone. People came from places I would not have expected. A woman drove overnight from Ohio because she had read a story on the internet and she thought, with a kind of desperate hope, that the man had told her where her son was years earlier. She arrived at the emergency room entrance with nothing but a small duffel and a hand-lettered sign. I remember her face like it was a lit map of worry and courage. She said she had to know. I sat with her and we made a plan to look into the details she remembered. It was the sort of request that does not fit neat categories. It was not a protocol. It was human. The more I listened, the more I saw how much of healthcare is not about finding a clean cause and effect but about listening and bearing witness. People wanted to be seen. They wanted someone to remember their names and the names they carried in their pockets. A man with a frail mother wanted to tell me every time he could not sit with her because work made him weak. A nurse wanted to say she had not spoken to her brother in 5 years. A transporter wanted to know if the small kindness she gave at 3 in the morning meant anything at all. Those conversations were not flashy. They were quiet as breath. But they mattered. Institutionally, the hospital reacted in the way hospitals do, with policies and meetings and risk assessments. The administration called together security, pastoral care, records, and legal to figure out what had actually happened. Someone asked the practical questions that keep hospitals safe: who admitted this person, who signed consent, how do we reconcile missing records? It was all sensible. I will not pretend otherwise. Systems exist so people do not get lost. Yet it was the absence that bothered me most. The empty files were like a wound that refused to scar. We tried to make sense of it without losing the small, human miracle that had happened. Pastoral care suggested increasing chapel visits for patients who wanted them. Records asked for better documentation of non-medical social needs. I worked with the training team to begin a short curriculum about bedside presence, not a replacement for clinical skill, but a complement to it. We taught interns how to ask a patient something small: what music do you like, who can we call for you, and how to really listen to the answer. It sounds simple, but it was a skill many of us had let atrophy. Diego, who had once been bent on a path toward surgery, began seeking out time in psychiatric units and counseling centers. He told me he felt silly at first. He loved the clean logic of sutures and incisions. But he also loved the way a single sentence could change the arc of a life. He said he wanted to learn how to help people bear the things they could not stitch. He asked me to write him letters of support. I wrote them, clumsy and earnest, because I wanted him to have whatever courage he needed. Teresa went to Houston and found Camilla. It was not a movie reunion. It was messy conversations and coffee shop noise and tears that were not neat. But it was alive. She came back to the ward a different woman, quieter but kinder to herself. Sonia began to tell stories she had hidden for years. She told her sister that she had been ashamed of leaving their father, and when she said it out loud she felt less like a traitor and more like a human who had made a hard choice. Not everything unspooled beautifully. There were people who took advantage. There were charlatans and con artists everywhere in the world, and someone in the city suggested that perhaps this was one more example. I met a woman who confessed she had lost money trying to chase miracles she had seen on late-night television. It made me cold to think we could be trading hope for exploitation. So we worked to protect people who were vulnerable. Meanwhile, the hospital's quieter new habits began to produce small but meaningful results. One of the night shift nurses told me her father and she had stopped speaking after he had a stroke years ago. They had been enemies through grief. After a midnight conversation at the bedside, she made a call and they began to speak again. Those conversations did not look good on a balance sheet, but they changed the way a person breathed. That mattered. My personal life, which for years had been the thing I hid under clinical competence, started to shift in ways I did not expect. I began to visit the places that had been off-limits. I went back to Ethan's favorite park bench. I walked through the path where his red soccer ball had once rested in the grass. I did not go there to pray in any formal way. I only went to sit and to admit, in a small and stubborn voice that had been missing for too long, that I missed him. I left a small rock on the bench because my hands needed to do something physical to mark my presence. I also found myself writing to Anna. I had not sent her a letter in years. I told myself 1,000 rehearsed things, that it was foolish, that it was a reopening of old wounds, but one night I set aside the rules and wrote. I did not expect an answer. I only wanted her to know that I had not kept living the way he had seemed to demand. I had spent years using work as an anesthetic. I told her I was trying to remember how to be present. I did not know whether she would write back. She did not at first. But writing felt like a small beginning. There were nights when I still wanted to reduce everything to numbers and charts. It is who I am. I still order tests, I still insist on evidence where evidence matters, and I still find great reassurance in the things that medicine can measure. But I had learned that evidence is not the only currency of truth. I had seen tenderness move a person in ways I could not explain on a lab report. At the same time, people from outside the hospital began to look to us for a kind of tenderness they could not manufacture on their own. Volunteers came to sit with patients whose families could not be there. A group of local musicians arranged a small recital in the chapel on a Sunday afternoon. They did not bill it as a religious thing. They called it a moment for the hospital. People came. They sat in the pews and listened. A woman in oncology said it was the first time in months she had not counted the hours. Not everyone was convinced. A small handful of clinicians remained openly skeptical, and that is fair. Medicine is strengthened by skepticism. It keeps us honest. One of our senior attendings insisted we maintain rigorous standards and pushed for audits of the records. I agreed with him. We will not throw away the systems that protect people because a story is pretty or comforting. But we can also modify systems to protect the human things that do not fit neatly into forms. One Saturday I found myself back in the chapel late, the sun dropping like melted gold across the glass, and there was a single candle burning on the altar. It left a small pool of light. I sat for a long time and thought about what had happened and what I had wanted to happen. I thought of the man who called himself Jesus Christ and of the way he had looked at me as if he had been waiting for a long time. I thought about whether I believed in miracles. I am still a doctor who values proof. I am still a man who sleeps poorly on the nights when an outcome goes the wrong way. But I am also a man who has learned to notice the small openings where kindness can enter. Those openings have become, for me, the closest thing to a miracle, the phone call that reconnects a family, the moment a nurse sits and listens, the impulse to ask a patient who they want on the other end of a line. A reporter once asked me whether I felt threatened by the unlikely. Do I worry that stories like this could be dangerous? I said yes. I said we must always be careful. But I also said this: if we are so certain that numbers are the only thing that matters, then we will miss what keeps people alive between tests. That answer felt honest. The hospital continued to do what hospitals do: it saved lives with blood and surgery and medicine. It also began to change slowly into a place where presence was valued in the same breath as protocol. That was not an easy change. It required meetings and edits to policy and a willingness among staff to ask a different set of questions. It required courage from doctors who are used to being the ones who know. For me, the biggest shift was internal. I still carry Ethan in the same way most fathers carry lost children, as an ache that never fully goes away. But I also carry a new set of memories. When a family thanks me and does not ask me for a miracle but simply for steadiness, I give it. When a trainee trembles during a resuscitation and looks like a small boat in a storm, I hold steady. The man in Bay 3 taught me that medicine is not merely the art of fixing bodies. It is also the art of staying. I do not know where the story goes from here. The man who called himself Jesus Christ left no file, no address, no record. He left small flames of change. That may be all he intended. Some things do not need to be proven to be true. They need to be lived. Part 4 ends here. If you want me to keep going, I will tell you what came after the ripples, the ways the city began to notice, the moments when the smallest acts of kindness became a quiet movement, and what it did to me in the long run. I did not expect a ripple to turn into a current. I suppose that is the way most changes begin, small, almost private, until someone else notices and decides to name it. The things that had shifted inside our hospital started to leak out into the city. People who had been touched by the quiet courage of a single night began to tell friends, then family, then strangers. The story moved like weather. It softened people. It made some of them angry. It made some of them hopeful. It made others curious enough to come and see for themselves. The first weekend after the vanishing, a group of volunteers showed up with coffee and muffins. They were not hospital volunteers in the formal sense. They were neighborhood people who had read a column and felt something tug at them. They sat in the chapel and did not pray in any formal way. They lit a few candles, they listened, and when they left small notes, a thank you, a memory, a request. People began to leave things in the chapel: a scarf, a photograph of a dog, a small piece of pottery. It looked like a shrine only in the sense that it held memory and kindness. The hospital began to have a different kind of foot traffic. Not everyone came looking for miracles, many simply came looking for quiet or a place where someone else might remember their name. More reporters came. Podcasts wanted interviews. The city paper wanted to know whether a single patient could change the culture of care at one of its busiest hospitals. I answered questions the best I could, and I gave the same line over and over: I do not know if the man who called himself Jesus Christ was who he said he was. What I know is that people left here acting kinder to one another, and that is verifiable. That answer did not satisfy some folks who wanted a tidy narrative. It did not comfort others who wanted only proof. It did, however, start conversations outside the hospital about what someone loses when medical institutions forget to ask who a person is beyond their diagnosis. There were moments when the attention felt dangerous. Con artists read headlines too. We had to be careful to protect vulnerable people who might be preyed upon by those looking to exploit grief or hope. The hospital tightened some protocols about public access to wards and how volunteers could be vetted. We had to balance openness with prudence. It felt like walking a fence between generosity and realism. At the same time, strangers showed up with stories. A man from the Bronx came by, his hat in his hands, and told us that he had been in the ER the night the patient arrived. He had watched from the corner and had not spoken to anyone afterward. He told me he had been a cynic for 50 years and that something in his chest had changed that night. He called his sister, whom he had not spoken to in a decade, and they cried on the phone. Simple acts, small reunions, they stacked up like quiet bricks and built a new room inside the city, one where kindness was allowed to be routine again. Not everyone found comfort. There were people who felt angry at the idea that an unregistered patient could walk in and touch lives without any accountability. There were families who thought attention should be redirected to structural issues: understaffing, long wait times, the health disparities that leave some neighborhoods worse off. Those critiques were valid. I sat in meetings where administrators and community leaders talked about how to invest in prevention, in housing, in mental health services, all the things that keep hospital visits from being the only place people meet help. The story of Bay 3 had opened a door, but it was not the solution to every problem. It did, however, force a few conversations to happen that might have otherwise been delayed. Anna, who for a long time had been the person I walked around quietly, re-entered my life in ways I did not fully plan. After many months of small, tentative letters, she finally wrote back. Her response was not cinematic. It was a postcard with 2 sentences that said more than they admitted. She missed some of what we had, and she forgave me for the ways I had turned away from being her partner. She did not ask for reconciliation on a silver platter. She wanted to know if I had learned to be present. I told her the truth. I told her that I had been learning, that some part of me had been freed to feel again, that I missed Ethan in a way that was like a second skin. We arranged to meet in a neutral place, a small diner with bad coffee and good pie. Talking to her was like stepping into cold water. It shocked, it hurt, and then it warmed as we said the names of the things we had been afraid to say. We did not pretend the past did not happen. We spoke of Ethan until we were both tired. We agreed that the future would be cautious and honest. I do not know where it will go. I only know that the fact she opened the door was a kind of healing I had not expected and did not realize I needed as much as I needed air. Meanwhile, the changes we baked into the system began to take shape. We launched a modest pilot project called Presence Rounds. The idea was simple: 1 clinician and 1 nurse would do a bedside check that was explicitly non-clinical, 48 hours after admission. They would ask about the small things, favorite songs, who they wanted called, fears that had nothing to do with labs. We did not bill for it. We documented it simply as personal needs noted, a line that administrators could accept without disrupting insurance protocols. The pilot was small at first, but the results surprised even the hard-headed people in data analytics. Patients reported feeling more satisfied with care, family members reported fewer frantic calls at night, and staff reported less moral fatigue. It appears that presence, though not codified in our old metrics, had a measurable benefit after all. Diego, now settled into a psychiatry rotation, would come by and tell me stories from the clinic. He told me how a man with chronic pain began to cry when someone finally asked him what gave his life meaning. He told me about the bravery it took for a person to admit fear over a call to a distant relative. It was, he said, small work, but the sort that prevents future crises because human beings who feel seen are more likely to reach out before a problem becomes an emergency. I realized, in those conversations, that healing is sometimes preventative in ways that do not make it into morbidity statistics. Teresa and Camilla stayed in touch. They came back to the hospital one quiet afternoon to bring a box of pastries for the night staff. I watched them from the observation corridor and felt something close to wonder. Their reunion had been messy and hopeful and not fixed all at once. That was the point. It made the hospital into a place where stories could continue rather than end suddenly. I learned to sit with the strange facts as well as the helpful results. The empty bed in Bay 3 was still an unsolved problem. The records were blank. Security footage had gaps. There were plausible administrative explanations, but none of them fit the full truth of what I had felt under my palm. I had to live with that ambiguity. I have spent my life trying to reduce uncertainty. This was a new kind of uncertainty that required patience more than answers. People asked me, often and with varying tones, whether I believed he was really who he said he was. I never gave a simple yes. I told people what I saw, a man who did not leave a paper trail but who managed to coax people into saying the soft names they had long held back. I told them about the hospital that seemed gentler afterward. I said that perhaps it did not matter whether the vanishing had been a miracle in the supernatural sense or a confluence of human longing and coincidence. The meaningful thing, I argued, was what happened to us because of it. That is a truth that is hard to measure but easy to witness. Sometimes I would catch myself looking for him in the city. I would ride the subway and watch faces and wonder if any stranger might have been the one. I would find people who seemed kind in ordinary ways and nod to them like a man who recognizes kin. It is a silly thing, perhaps, to search for a person who may have been more symbol than individual, but grief makes people do strange things. We look for footprints where we have only memories. There were quieter miracles, too. Old grudges were revisited. Fathers and sons called. A woman in oncology told me she had reconciled with a sister she had not spoken to for 20 years, and that helped her go into treatment with fewer hidden burdens. Small things multiplied. They were not dramatic. They did not always get written up in a newsletter. They were, in the way that kindness often is, slow and persistent. I kept that scrap of paper I had found in the chapel in my pocket for months. The phrase on it, "The greatest miracles are not in healing the body but in remembering how to love," was a torpedo of simplicity that kept me from drowning in clinical cynicism. I read it when a shift went sideways. I read it when I saw a resident clutching the aftermath of a bad code. It became less of an instruction and more of an orientation. I began to measure success in ways that complemented survival rates: the number of families who felt heard, the interns who stayed in medicine because someone had mentored them, the staff who told me they no longer gripped exhaustion like a talisman. There is a humility in admitting that you have been changed. I had spent a long time teaching my team that certainty and competence protect patients. They do. They also sometimes become shields that keep us from being present. The man in Bay 3 loosened that shield for me and for many others. He did not do it with fanfare. He did it by saturating a place with attention and then leaving. I am not sure why the universe would pick that method. I only know that it worked here. One summer evening, months after that first night, a mother came into the emergency room carrying a small red soccer ball. She said the ball had been her son's, and that in a moment of panic months ago she had brought it here to feel closer to him after a bad accident. She left it on the chair in Bay 3 as a kind of unspoken offering. I looked at it and remembered Ethan, his laugh, his curls, how seriously he treated the game. I took the ball and put it on the bench near the chapel. I sat there for a long time, and I let myself remember without pretending to fix anything. That was the best kind of religion I could manage, memory that honors instead of erases. There were nights when I still woke with that old, jagged echo in my chest. The ache of a small boy not growing up does not go away. It changes shape and becomes a thread through other days. Sometimes the thread knotted tight and I would have to step out of the ward and into the chapel and sit with the candle until the trembling in my hands eased. Sometimes I would call Anna and our conversation would be awkward but honest. Sometimes I would write in my notebook about the day a resident properly leaned in to listen to a patient and the patient cried and then made a phone call that saved them from a crisis. Years from now, I do not imagine anyone will be able to fully prove all that happened in Bay 3. Records can be wrong, cameras can fail, memory is a tricky instrument. What I can prove, however, is the way people started to carry each other afterward. There is a kind of evidence in an extra cup of patience, in the way an orderly will sit a while longer with a confused patient. There is evidence in the woman who reconciled with her sister and in the man who called his estranged brother. That is the ledger I trust now. If I have learned one thing from all of this, it is that healing is not always a thing done to someone. Sometimes healing is a practice we do together. It looks nothing like a single miraculous act and everything like consistent, small decisions that say you are not alone. I have taught that to trainees and to myself. It is the work I show up for now with more hunger and more softness. Now, when I walk past the chapel, I see people sitting quietly, sometimes with a phone or a cup of coffee. Sometimes there is a small knot of interns comparing notes. The flickering candle still has a little pool of wax around it. Someone replaced the small rock on Ethan's bench with a pebble someone had left with a note, "For those who miss." It is a small gesture, and it is enough. I do not have all the answers. I have no tidy ending to a story that is messy and human. But I have learned to live with a kind of open question that feels less like a wound and more like a window. The man who called himself Jesus Christ may have been a stranger who wandered in on a rainy night, or he may have been something else I do not have words for. Either way, he left us with something useful, a reminder that medicine without human presence is only half a practice, and that sometimes the hardest work is to remember how to love while we do the work we know how to do. If you come to the chapel someday, you will find a stack of small notes by the candle. People leave them there without ceremony. They are simple: "Thank you, I forgive you, I am sorry, I love you." They are not prescriptions. They are not protocols. They are small promises. That is how the story continues, not with a bang or a tidy resolution, but with 100 little promises that people make to one another when they decide to be present. I am still a doctor. I still measure and chart and fight for lives with procedures and medicine. I also make space now for a question I had long avoided: Who are you when no machine is measuring you? I ask that question to patients and to myself. It is the best question I know how to ask. That is the last part of the story as I have lived it so far. The hospital keeps turning, as hospitals do. People still get sick. People still lose those they love. But the air here has changed. Pain is still pain. Grief still breaks people open. Yet we have learned to stand in the brokenness together. That, for me, is enough to keep going.